Hello again, and welcome to the Indoor Environment Show. I'm Bob Krell, founder and publisher of Healthy Indoors magazine. And as always, I'm joined by my co host, Mr. Don Weeks, who is the president of the Indoor Environmental Quality Global Alliance, IEQGA. And my understanding is he's going to be the president for a bit longer. Your retirement doesn't seem like retirement, but that's another story.
Yes, I just announced that I would run again for a second 3-year term. So we'll see how that all works out. How are you this morning, Bob?
I'm always chipper. So,
That's true. You are. That's your
I
nickname.
try to be. I put on a good facade anyway.
Yeah, that's
So,
right. Well, we're very good for today to be chipper because we have a very special guest today, Dr. Stephanie Taylor. And she has an MD from Harvard Medical School and has a master's degree in architecture from Norwich College. Very unusual, but very interesting. She is the CEO and founder of Building Health Inc. and is also the CEO of Taylor Healthcare Consulting Inc. Dr. Taylor is also a member of the ASHRAE Environmental Health Committee, and she is an ASHRAE Distinguished Lecturer. Welcome.
Without further ado, let's bring her in.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi. So happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me to speak.
Yes, well, we're very glad to have you here too. We have a few questions, as you know, but we'll start with one which goes into your background somewhat. Give me just a second to get it pulled up here. You have a medical degree, as we mentioned, from Harvard Medical, cum laude, and a master's degree in architecture from Norwich College, Northfield, Vermont, also cum laude. How did you become interested in indoor air quality, and in particular, IAQ in hospitals?
So, Don, that's a great question. And I'll give you the short answer, given that I'm 66 years old and my interest really began a long time ago. But so in general, I'm pretty fascinated by biology, and I'm fascinated by physiology, human physiology, and how all these things work together. So when I was in medical school, after having gone to school nonstop forever, I decided I needed a break. So I went to Papua New Guinea for 4 months and practiced medicine as a medical student. And during that 4-month stint in New Guinea, where the surface hygiene looked dismal to me, and yet the patients did well, when I came back to the Boston teaching hospitals, where everything looked pristine, and yet patients weren't doing so well. And this whole epidemic of healthcare associated infections, which are infections people get presumably through exposure to the hospital environment, were a huge problem. So I asked my mentor, my med school mentor, Dr. Folkman, who's chief of surgery at Children's, I said, Dr. Folkman, I don't get this. And he said, Stephanie, don't ever forget the role of the environment in patient healing or in health in general. So as I continued my clinical work and I was doing pediatric oncology, I never forgot his words. And so as I was doing my patient care, it began to seem like certain infectious organisms were sequestered to parts of the hospital building. And there were these patterns that seemed more related to the built environment than to either the underlying disease or the clinical processes. So I tried to talk to the facility folks, and they were like, oh my God, here comes this doctor who takes our time up and she doesn't know what we're talking about. And we don't know what she's talking about. So they began to run and hide when they saw me coming. And I realized that if I were ever going to really understand the role of the hospital-built environment in patient healing, I realized that I needed to learn something about buildings and mechanical systems. So I went back to school, got my master's in architecture, and designed hospitals for about 8-9 years before moving to a more research and consulting role. But it's been quite a fascinating journey.
Yes, I would say so. Could you talk a little bit about what you did in terms of designing hospitals for, I guess, for better environment than it had been in the past? Give us some details on some of that.
Well, so the biggest detail is that hospital architects were not really interested in designing hospitals specifically with infection control as a priority. It was more about, look, we need these windows, we need these open spaces, the doctors all want corner offices. You doctors are just a pain in the neck, you're arrogant, you're difficult to work with. So I can't really say that during my designing phase, I was successful in advancing the idea of designing hospitals for patient outcomes, to be totally honest.
Hmm.
But
you're honest about it, but can you give us some of the problems that you encountered? What was some of the roadblocks in your way?
I think that's a great question. For one thing, I'll answer that question not only in the context of designing hospitals, but in my work as a consultant around this topic. And one of the problems is that at the moment, hospitals are mandated to self-report their infection rates. And it's sort of like asking your 8th grade kid to bring home their report card. It often reflects their wishful thinking more than the reality. And so in terms of hospitals, the very folks I thought would be the most helpful or sometimes the most fearful of my questions. And those are the infection preventionists. Mm-hmm. Because in order to show progress or improvement, you kind of need a good baseline. And I think in hospitals, because there are so many penalties and financial consequences to patient errors, such as infections, that hospitals were nervous about having an outsider like myself come in and establish a baseline. So the whole attitude in hospitals about that somebody's to blame for a problem and therefore there are going to be penalties really got in the way and gets in the way of full disclosure. So I think I ran into that a lot, and on the heels of disclosure are the hospital lawyers. So yeah, so
I can see in my experience, working consulting work, indoor environmental consulting work in healthcare facilities, I would totally concur. It doesn't seem like they're forthcoming with a lot of information. When you're brought in for a specific issue, but to try to delve deeper into get into what the problem is, it doesn't seem like you get an awful lot of support, especially from the facility side and the infection control side, ironically. Yeah.
But I did have one absolutely fortuitous event happen that kind of set me forward in the next chapter of my professional life. And I can tell you about that.
Please do.
So this was a study that was being done in the Chicago area in a brand new hospital. It was a study being done by microbiologists who had the tools of metagenomic analysis. So they were able to really take a look at the communities of bacteria and viruses and fungal organisms that were in the building, not based on tissue culture alone, but based on looking at DNA and RNA fingerprints of organisms in the building. So this group was doing a study where they monitored a brand new hospital, starting from before the time it was occupied up until a year later. And so it was brand new, single rooms, LEED silver, beautiful hospital. And every 5 to 30 minutes, they were monitoring patient room and nursing station environments. And simultaneously, they are tracking the microbiome of the building, meaning, the organisms on surfaces and in the air. And once the building was occupied, they were able to also test some of the patient microbiomes. So I found out about this and I was like, this is incredible. So I called the head of the study and I said, I'd love to look at patient outcomes. And, I think he was excited too. And so next thing I know is I have like 400 electronic medical records in my inbox. And I was like, wow, this is incredible. And that was before the hospital lawyers started sending me letters.
It's fascinating. So they were tracking that in real time?
Well,
or, semi-real time. I mean, they were taking ongoing samples and running that.
They had about 8 million data points from the hospital environment. And then I had about 400 patient records and they were sort of stratified according to the illness that brought the patient in there. So there was sort of a natural control. Plus we just had so many data points that we were able to have a statistically significant study. And so I can tell you what we found if you want.
Please, go ahead.
Well, so for first of all, but just to back up a little bit, prior to that study, and you're probably familiar with this, Bob, if you're looking at the cleanliness of a hospital, the techniques are generally, or at least they were 10 years ago, using Petri dishes or swabbing surfaces and seeing what you find. But I realized that while those are valuable techniques, you can also think about the most important sort of test metric or biomarker for a hospital building, and that's the patient. So all of a sudden I thought, wait a minute, what if we sort of viewed the patient as like the petri dish in the bed, so to speak? You know, I wouldn't tell my loved one that I'm looking at them as a petri dish in the bed,
but that's the important petri dish.
Yeah, it's the most.
That's actually the one that matters in the space.
Most specific. It's the most sensitive. And if you've ever been in the hospital, you know that you're having tons of data collected on you.
Right.
You know, blood pressure, pulse, temperature, imaging, cultures, blood work. And I thought, what an amazing reservoir of data. So I began to see the patient as a building, patient healing as a building performance metric. Mm-hmm. And it's really that line of thinking that's carried me forward to what I do now. But back then, if I can go back, we sent a massive amount of data to our statistician, and we were looking at things like room air changes, pressurization, lighting, CO2, temperature, humidity, light, like lumens or lux, whichever term you're used to. Certain things were the same. Filtration rates were the same. So we were just looking at the environmental parameters that changed. And it came back that, and this was a shock to me, that when the relative humidity in the patient room was low, the infection rate was high. But it was also a seasonal trend. So I was very skeptical. I thought, wait a minute. I always thought that if you have your relative humidity like between this 40 to 60, you would have, it's kind of like watering a garden. You'd have more organisms causing problems. But, you know, I've done a lot of work subsequent to that study. And this finding about the importance of a mid-range relative humidity for human health continues to hold. But I was, like I say, I didn't understand it, and I frankly didn't believe it. I hadn't really heard a lot about it before, although there has been other stuff about it written. But anyway, we repeated the study in a nursing home over 4 years and found the same thing, that low relative humidity indoors is a big driver of increased infections.
And was that more of a seasonal thing? You mentioned seasonal. Was it more during the heating months in facilities?
Yes. And so I thought, well, there are probably some other confounding variables that are causing this, you know, whether it's a flu season or there are more visitors. So my statistician said, look, this is an independent variable. And that's the definition of that is we've filtered out these other potentially confusing or confounding variables. And so now I have a better understanding about why, you know, and even during the pandemic, we're still finding this, that indoor relative humidity, and I say relative humidity, and engineers usually look like, oh, this woman's an idiot. She should be talking about dew point or absolute humidity. But I am talking about relative humidity because that's the metric that talks about the evaporative, you know, the vapor pressure with evaporation. Absolute humidity is I think more useful when you're talking about risks of condensation. But anyway, that's another discussion.
We'll get into that. That's a very big topic into it itself. And I don't want to jump ahead too far without having a chance to talk a little bit more about your choice of a career. You obtained a master's degree in architecture and engineering from Norwich. Can you tell us what might have triggered that change in your career path? I know you've talked a little bit about this hospital study in Chicago, but were there other specific incidences that influenced your decision to move in that direction?
I think, Don, in general, it was a good time in my life to, you know, make a transition. And so moving from solely doing patient care to sort of a broader research based pathway really worked for me. I've always been interested in research as well as clinical care. However, my prior research was more in cell biology, but I thought this is an opportunity to impact a lot more people than just the patients I'm laying my hands on. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, the family dynamics and stuff were such that it made a lot of sense for me to focus on this other area. And as I continued to move in that direction, as well as some like really fortuitous things that were happening in the world of research, such as bringing metagenomic analysis tools into the building assessment arena, to bringing a clinical tool into understanding the built environment, the advent of and the implementation of electronic medical records, which allow us to analyze a tremendous amount of data, the use of computerized statistical analysis. So these three things, assessment tools, patient data, and the ability to analyze the intersection of these things, just converged. It's not a perfect storm. It's a perfect sunrise.
But you certainly have a very unique skill set. This is not, in my experience in the industry, I haven't ran into many medical doctors that also have architectural degrees and have, that cross skill set gives you really a broad perspective, I would say, right? I mean,
yeah. And it was really hard. It was incredibly hard to make that shift. And the difficulties have given me understanding and sympathy around people who have trouble acknowledging that they don't know something in a different field. It's not easy. So for me, here I am in my 40s in architecture school. These kids are complaining about their parents, and I was just like, would you guys stop, please? We do the best we can. But furthermore, I didn't understand the design process at all for a while. And they're telling me, design a building in the persona of a dancer. And I'm just like, are you kidding me? And so because I didn't understand it, I was sort of angry. I was disparaging about it until one of my very wonderful professors said, help me. And then I was able to see, the design process of thinking is very different from clinical medicine. You don't open up somebody's abdomen and say, how does this inform what I do next? You don't do that. And I got through it, but it helps me understand why we're in the current conundrum, as I see it, where building science and engineering and architecture is kind of in one silo, to use that overused metaphor, and medicine and clinical care is separate. And it's been, despite the pandemic, which has brought these two areas closer, there is still tremendous resistance. And some of it, it's not psychological or cognitive. Some of it's, medicine's really the business of sickness. Engineers, and even ASHRAE some years ago, Don, they said, we're not in the business of testing and balancing people. That's really not what we do. And I don't hear that anymore. But, and ASHRAE and engineers have been much more flexible about considering health than the medical community has been about environmental inputs.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And but even the engineering part of it is a relatively new phenomenon, in terms of having them more interested in health of the building occupants. But it's still not totally there yet, as serving as you and I both do on the EHC Environmental Health Committee. It's a long stretch for many of them because they've come up through the part of this as being not part of the medical community, as it were, and not really dealing with the medical community very much. So it's very interesting what you have done, and I think it's very, very much appreciated by many people who don't have that type of background. So I did want to ask you about one item I saw on your CV where you were talking about a patent for a device for assessing and managing health impact of an indoor environment at a site location. Can you describe what this device is and how it works?
Sure. And that's actually the basis of my current company called Building for Health, or B for H. So I was doing a lot of consulting around using human health as a metric for the building. So in a hospital, the studies I talked about, looking at schools and trying to understand how the environment affected student learning and absenteeism. And so I was working around using human metrics as a window into the building performance. And actually, to be honest, my brother, Peter, had been watching what I was doing. And he said, Steph, 20 years ago, LEED was created, and it kind of gave sustainability or energy conservation a platform from which to grow. And he said, what if we, this is my younger brother, all of a sudden it's we. I was like, okay, that's cool. What if we scale this approach to of looking at human factors as a window into the building and form a company and scale this approach? Because you can't do it the way you're doing it. And I was like, that sounds great. I don't know anything about forming companies. But we did. And so that was 2.5 years ago. And part of that scaling process has been to identify the metrics in an indoor environment, specifically indoor air quality metrics. 11 metrics that have a quantifiable impact on the human body. So temperature, humidity particles, VOCs, ozone, combustion, byproducts like NO2 and SO2, carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, and take these 11 metrics and the interaction of them and to quantify their biological impact on occupants, and then recommend remediation for the building based on the output of those metrics. So that patent applies to the sensor array that, and along with the sensitivity and specificity of those sensors, that monitors those factors, and then our algorithm, which creates a biological quantification of individual and combined metrics based on, not only based on exposure, but based on what those indoor, I'll call them pollutants for lack of a better word, what they do to your health and to your immune system, to your metabolic process, to inflammation. And so that whole thing, the measurement, the algorithm, and the remediation based on the health impact was what we patented.
And are you able to use that device to this day, or is that device available to anyone other than your company?
Yeah. So then we eventually so when we identified these metrics, we interviewed lots of sensor companies about creating this device, and we landed on TSI. They're a great company, great reputation. Their sensors are fantastic. So we joined forces. We're not supposed to call it a partnership. We're strategic something in the legal world. But anyway, so TSI manufactured the sensor. So you can buy the sensor through our website, or you can go on TSI easier through our website and install it. You just hang it on the wall, plug it in, and begin generating your health impact score along with, and you can see what the breakdown is. And then we prompt remediation options based on indoor and outdoor conditions. So yes, you can get it. And yes, we're using it.
Right. I assume, yeah. So this B4H is your company, Building for Health Inc. And it's apparently you founded it, as you said, about 2.5 years ago. And can you give us you described the sensors, but is there a process that B4H uses to evaluate human health in buildings?
So when I was going through your questions, Don, I was thinking about that question. And so we don't actively collect human being metrics or biomarkers on the occupants. So the quantification, we measure the indoor environment, and then the resulting score is based on, sort of a deep knowledge of, epidemiology studies, toxicology, and more cell biology studies. So initially we wanted to actually track, blood oxygenation and heart rate changes and salivary cortisol levels in the occupants. And we are designing some proof of concept studies using biomarkers, but right now we're not tracking human health metrics. So it's based on a deep dive research.
Okay, that's good. And you mentioned TSI, and I guess this announcement of this, they're calling it teaming, I guess, and indicated that the visibility of health impact on IEQ allows cost-effective building management to align indoor environments with conditions known to support occupant health and productivity.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could describe what building owners, managers with possible IEQ issues can expect if they contract with this collaboration.
Sure. And Don, let's come back to humidity at some point.
Yeah, we will. No, that we don't worry. I know that we will.
Well, just because it's a really fascinating topic for a number of reasons. But so wait, what was your question again?
I'm wondering if you were a building owner or a manager, how would you, and you have indoor air quality problems or issues that people have talked about in there, and they want to have somebody like your company and TSI be involved, what can they expect to see as a result of that investigation?
So I'll tell you an early study. It's actually in a senior living community where this group of senior living communities, really nice ones around the US, were on the brink of purchasing several $1 million of air cleaning devices. And they said, hey, we know about you, Stephanie. We've learned about B for H. So will you monitor our buildings? And we would like to just purchase 1 or 2 air cleaning devices before we spend a ton of money. So we said, sure. So they sent us the building plans. One sensor will cover about 7,000 square feet, but you don't have to monitor every single square foot of or cubic foot of your space. Mm-hmm. You can just monitor different use case areas. But anyway, so they set this up. They gained access to our platform and the visibility, and they found out a couple things. And this is somewhat typical. One, they found out that their buildings were in great shape already. Number 2, they found out that the air cleaning devices actually had some unintended consequences that caused more problems. They weren't needed, and they weren't adding anything good. So they kind of backed up and re-strategized. And now we're doing some proof of concept. We're doing some more pilot studies in a wider swath of their buildings. And we're looking at health outcomes in the residents. So they've been an awesome early adopter. But that's the sort of thing you can expect. So you get in touch with us, we get on the phone, we either purchase the sensor and the software analysis, or we will be more engaged in helping determine how many sensors and where they should go, and walking people through the visibility and the remediation steps. I mean, we're still a startup. It's only 2.5 years, but joining forces with TSI has been great.
That's good. Well, it's a good start, no doubt about it. And you did mention, and I wanted to bring this up because I think that if I may, one of the things that has been a trademark of yours is talking about the relative humidity in buildings. And about 2 years ago, you wrote a petition to WHO, World Health Organization, to request that they set a standard of 40 to 60% relative humidity in buildings. And, there was a quote that I have there, but basically it comes down to, you think it's time for regulations of indoor air quality include humidity levels of 40 to 60% relative humidity. Can you tell us more about the scientific evidence to support setting a 40 to 6% RH standard?
Yeah. And again, here, Don, I have learned a lot, and I've learned about some of the difficulties in humidification. But before we talk about that, the reason that I'm an advocate of that range are really for 4 reasons that improve the health of building occupants. One, if you have that amount of water vapor in your environment, the respiratory immune system, so like how dehydrated your mucous membranes are and other consequences, 40 to 60% supports a healthy respiratory immune system. There's a study out of Yale 2019 that's absolutely brilliant by Akiko Iwasaki. And she showed that, for example, at 20% relative humidity, this was done in genetically engineered mice, because she was taking the tracheas out and chopping them up. And you can't really do that to your colleagues.
No.
Yeah. So she got genetically engineered mice that had the analogous immune system as humans, and condition them in 20% versus 50% and expose them to influenza. What she found was that 20% relative humidity, the mammalian immune system is significantly impaired. So not only are your membranes dry, which, like if you fly in an airplane for more than a couple hours, you know that, but the little cilia that wash particles away from your lungs, the little cilia in your airways don't function properly. But it's even more than that. Do you remember with COVID-19, some patients were getting into what was called a cytokine storm, where their own immune system kind of worked against them?
Right.
Well, one of the big drivers of a cytokine storm is when your body doesn't produce interferon, which is a protective protein. So you're exposed to the virus, early inflammation sets up in your body. The best response is an interferon production by your cells. But what Dr. Iwasaki found was that interferon production is diminished when you have inadequate water vapor in inhaled air and some other protective proteins. So it just opens the door to such a fascinating understanding of how we interact with our environment. So mid-range humidity protects your immune system and your skin as well. It kind of, the particles in the air, whether they're biotic or abiotic, most are hygroscopic. So with water vapor, they glom together and settle out of the air. So your breathing zone is better. And strategies such as filtration, a MERV 13 filter, or a more porous filter is going to be more effective if you have mid-range humidity. And I have these references, but not on the tip of my tongue. And even things like air movement with ventilation is more effective when you're not just dealing with tiny droplet nuclei. So relative humidity in that range supports your immune system. It creates a cleaner breathing zone. We're not talking about mold yet.
Right.
Ironically, Lindsay Marr out of Georgia Tech and some other folks have done studies that show that when you exhale a droplet into that mid-range humidity, that the droplet shrinks down, because it's going from 100% saturation in your airways to say 40. But in mid-range humidity, that droplet shrinks down to such a point that the stuff in the droplet, right, it's shrinking. So the concentration of salts and mucins and proteins rise. And in that mid-range zone, many microbes are inactivated. I mean, it's like, thank you, Mother Nature. But if you're in a dry environment, those droplets shrink down so quickly that the salts actually preserve the microbes. And so you might have these teeny tiny particles floating around. And we used to think they were innocuous because they wouldn't grow in tissue culture. But using the metagenomic analysis tools, we now know that many of those tiny desiccated particles have dormant microbes, but once those microbes are rehydrated in somebody else's airway, they're highly infectious. It's almost like survival of the fittest. So that's the third reason. Mid-range relative humidity, the expired droplets tend to be less infectious. And fourth, and this is really hard to talk about in the time of a pandemic, but are you guys familiar with the microbiome of your body?
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah. So buildings have a microbiome, right? They have communities that live indoors. Bacteria, viruses, fungal organisms. Most microbes actually support our health. We now know that. Clearly not all of them. SARS-CoV-2 doesn't. Legionella doesn't. Aspergillus doesn't. But when you have that mid-range humidity, the building microbiome tends to be more diverse. So you don't have an overpopulation of pathogenic organisms. You tend to have a more diverse, what's called commensal microbiome in a building. So when I think about the environment, so it's not only do you have viruses in your air or do you have carbon monoxide, it's what is that air doing to the human being? And what is that air doing to the other occupants of the building, meaning the microbes? So I think the benefits of mid-range humidity is it supports all the occupants. The problems with mid-range humidity are in many buildings, especially in a cold temperature, the thermal the insulation isn't, there are thermal channels in your walls or around pipes, and you reach dew point temperatures, and you have liquid condensation or water, and that's what supports mold. So the whole humidity word has sort of I call it like the H word. It's like engineers are like, go away with your humidity talk. We're sick of hearing about it.
But that's a challenge, right? I mean, that is the challenge because, again, from a climate zone, you have to have two different technologies, right? You have to have humidification and dehumidification to balance in there based on the climate zone, based on the time of year. And I can see that being challenging both ways. Obviously, an energy drain on the dehumidification side when you're trying to reduce it down to 60% from a higher percentage. But actually humidifying a building is tricky, right? Because if you're just using potable water, a lot of times you have a lot of minerals, a lot of things in there that you don't necessarily want to steam humidify out there. If you use reverse osmosis, now it gets slightly acidic, right? 6.5 is pretty much what's coming off of those devices. So it's a little bit acidic.
I wasn't aware of the acidity part.
Yeah, it's a little. We did a study on a factory that had that issue, an electronics factory, and it actually was triggering some people that were asthmatic, just that slightly higher acidity rate, and it was actually triggering some stuff with people.
Yeah, I mean there are challenges, and when I was at the summer camp, we were talking about this, Bob, in Westford. And I gave my presentation, and Lou Harriman got up and said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa!"
We wrote the moisture handbook with Terry.
I know. I'm like, Lou.
So you triggered him right away.
I'm like, Lou, I know of you. I know you know of me. We worked it out.
Well, it's interesting you said that because he's and some other folks on the 62.1 committee have been debating this whole issue of relative humidity versus dew point. And it's not been resolved. Let's put it that way. And certainly, it's been written into as Bob mentioned, it's been written into the ASHRAE publication about moisture control, and in terms of dealing with the dew point humidification issue, is really difficult for engineers to kind of. They thought they had it. They thought they had it licked. We can do something other than relative humidity. We can do something that directly measures the moisture on surfaces, and that will help us basically design better ventilation systems. But it's not the 40 to 60% range. That's for sure. In terms
the problem
of
is even at super low relative humidity in cold climates, you could have an indoor relative humidity riding around 25% or less, even like on sub 20%, super dry or a perceived super dry environment. But you still have thermal bridging issues in building, in the building envelope, where even if it seems so dry that people are getting nosebleeds and their contacts are locked in their eyes, you still have liquid condensation in wall details on exterior walls that are fostering mold growth. So it's not. This is a complex issue.
It is, but I think the piece that is really interesting for me is that if you're considering the impact of low humidity, in this case, on the human occupant, it's really not good.
Sure.
And actually from my B4H work, Building for Health, we've discovered that when you have mid-range humidity, you actually lessen the harm from things like ozone that might be in your environment from either coming in from the outdoors or produced. So humidity also decreases harm from other indoor compounds. But back to what you were just saying, Don and Bob, I think that if we could really embrace an understanding that you need a certain amount of humidity in your environment, and more vulnerable people, so if you're really old, really young, if you're immunocompromised, it's especially important. So maybe, and the FGI will hate me for saying this, but maybe all rooms in a hospital should not have a view to the outdoors. Put a hologram on the wall, and building uses. I think it should be like a beehive. You don't put the queen bee.
Well, I mean, think about it makes sense though, because that whole thing of controlling thermal bridging and dew points, if you're in the interior of the building, that's a lot easier to achieve than on an exterior building envelope position. Yeah, I
think it might change the way we use spaces. And the other thing where I think there's a big opportunity is in building materials, because, untreated stone or wood or concrete, has microchannels. So there's adsorption of water vapor in the capillaries. And so if humidity is high, it adsorbs it, not AD. And then when the humidity is low, it releases water vapor. So I think by understanding sort of holistically the impact of the indoor environment on the people, it actually opens the door to advances in how building materials can positively contribute to indoor air quality. Not just keep your formaldehyde out, not just like don't do bad stuff. How do
you're suggesting a paradigm shift here, definitely, right? I mean, because we traditionally have not built buildings for occupant health.
Heaven forbid we would
at all. I mean, that's never been the case. So
I know.
Yeah, which kind of brings up another question that I had. You had mentioned in a recent column that you wrote about building codes, and you stated that currently written statements about building codes said that we need these standards to protect building materials. The missing concept, surprisingly, is the need for building codes to protect human health in the indoor environment. What changes would you recommend to building codes would help to protect human health?
So, yeah, and what I was really talking about are codes that protect against things like fires and floods and seismic activity, and as well as stuff you can sense, like the temperature. We deal with comfort, quote unquote. I actually have to read my notes here so I think that, as I see it, and this is sort of a wish list, one, acknowledge an indoor air quality standard based on health. And that's actually what we do with B4H, but I do it because I think it's important. I'm not talking about it because it's my company. But acknowledge an indoor air quality standard for human health, which is a broader topic than comfort. And I think we need to add monitoring beyond carbon dioxide, but add sort of comprehensive monitoring to spaces, because we don't have the ability to sense everything that's good or bad for us. We can see things, we can hear things, we can smell things, we can sense, sensible heat or temperature, but we can't sense dryness early enough. We can't sense ozone until it's really irritating our membranes. So I think acknowledge an indoor air quality standard for health, monitor to create visibility around the health impact, and take holistic steps based on the health impact to manage mechanical systems. So instead of, your design engineer saying, okay, well, this is the air change rate or the ventilation rate, and however that works, and you guys know more about design engineering set points, but have a more performance-based response with your mechanical systems. And so, for example, if you have high particles, maybe the best solution isn't to increase outdoor ventilation. Clearly, if the outdoor particles are high, maybe you need a more flexible strategy that includes humidification, filtration. Have remediation strategies that reflect the interaction of these indoor compounds and how they affect your health. So it's sort of like it's sort of like using human health or occupant health as your North Star. You keep your eye on it and you manage around that.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer, but getting it accepted may be a different story. And you mentioned some things about building codes, which I think are not what I would call they're not subject to discussion right now. It's the discussion on building codes really comes down to ventilation, how much ventilation you should have. What kind of mechanical systems do you have? Do you add humidification or dehumidification, depending on the circumstances? And those building codes are adopted almost directly from the ASHRAE 62.1 and 62.1 standards, which are issued every 3 years. It's a hard sell for engineers to basically make that decision. But I hear what you're saying. I appreciate what you're saying, because I'm on the health side of the things, but I'm also on 62.1 as well. So what do you feel are the next steps that need to be taken to kind of improve the environment for human occupancy?
Well, again, I think understanding that the environment has a big impact on our health, number one. Number two, monitoring the things that we know are important. Thirdly, I think beginning to think about a mid-range humidity is a good thing, even if you can't achieve it in all spaces, in all buildings. I get that. But because it's hard to do, don't say it's unimportant.
Understood.
But I think then I would ask you, Don, if you think this is important, what do you think would help sort of change people's mindsets?
Thank you for the question.
Sorry.
That's great. By the way, I'm really impressed that you threw it back at him. That's excellent.
Sorry, I love you, Don.
Well played, Dr. Taylor. Well played.
We are in the process right now in 62.1 putting together an enhanced indoor air quality manual or guidance. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to get the right word. Which we've been working on for about 5 years, and it takes time through the consensus building process to get this type of acceptance. And one of the things that we are just still debating, it relates to just this topic in terms of relative humidity versus dew point measurements and things of that nature, because we have two sides to it. You're already familiar with Lou Harriman. The other side is represented to some extent by Dennis Stanke, who's a well-respected mechanical engineer. And it's not an easy sell one way to the other, but both of them are very experienced and knowledgeable individuals who have very different viewpoints on this at this point. So you're right. I mean, we just completed 62.1 2022. We won't do another one until 2025. So you do have some time to come by and wish us the best of luck and express your viewpoint on how things are doing. And I encourage you to do so when we meet again in Atlanta at the ASHRAE winter meeting. So that's throwing it back at you.
No, I understand it. So you asked me the very last question. You said, how do I see the future of indoor air quality? Do we have time for that?
Absolutely. Yes. Go ahead.
I think that's a real important question.
So I actually am pretty excited. I think the pandemic has really focused people's attention on the role of the airborne environment with regards to health, or at least regards to exposure risks. But I think that managing the indoor environment properly is actually a huge opportunity for the human race, because as things stand now, there are other infectious organisms that are mutating. That there will be other epidemics and pandemics. There's certain human illnesses that have increased, inflammatory-based diseases, autoimmune disorders. But I think by properly managing the indoor environment, we can turn around these frightening trends and optimize our health, diminish the infectivity or the virulence of microbes that are more and more, some are becoming more virulent. But I think if we manage the indoor environment through the lens of human health, we really have an opportunity just to turn around some of these trends that are causing significant illnesses in people. So I think it's a huge opportunity. And even though I never wish this pandemic to happen, obviously, I think in a few short years, it's accomplished a new sort of focus on the indoor environment that we probably wouldn't have if we just kept on poking along, not really linking the indoor environment and health. So while I wish this pandemic had never happened, obviously it has, but I think we need to learn from it and use the opportunity to really improve human health and productivity.
You certainly, I mean, I totally concur with you on that. At this point in time, like never before in at least our lives, people are focused on the indoor environment more than they have been. So I think it's an easier sell maybe to do these enhancements and move things forward at this juncture. Well, I mean, it seems easier than it was maybe in 2019. But
I think the real opportunity, a tangible opportunity, is understanding how managing a building for human health can result in energy savings, because you can protect we don't want to get back into the sick building syndrome that we had in the 1990s when we sealed up buildings after the Arab oil embargo. We don't want to do that again. But if you keep your eye on human health, you can manage your ventilation rates, you can manage your air change rates, you can manage these things without harming the occupant. So I think that using human health standards actually affords opportunities to save energy and decrease carbon, the carbon footprint of a building.
Which, I mean, these are all important factors, right? But certainly, it seems like the occupant health, the wellness of the occupant should be paramount, right? I mean, the reason we have built environments is to protect ourselves in the outdoor environment and create, livable, safe things. And it just seems like we lost sight of that somehow.
I mean, I agree with you, obviously, Bob, but a couple people have said, hey, that's kind of like selling religion. It might get you like kind of a couple steps down the road, but unless you can have a more tangible return on investment, you better find a different argument.
Well, occupant productivity, but I mean that's hard. That's hard to quantify. That's the problem with the Harvard Syracuse University study. Definitely brought that to light too a few years back. But yeah, it's not an easy sell. You're right. It's not.
But like senior living communities are actually there's a real alignment between occupant health and their business models. I think that's why we've gained more traction there than in other building types.
Yeah, I think that's true. And certainly when the pandemic hit, it unfortunately many people in those type of facilities became ill and passed away because they had inadequate controls of various sorts, whether it be infection controls, whether it be ventilation, whether it be sanitation, whatever it might be. It's been a focus. The other focus that I think is important, though, and Matt, maybe you wish to make a few comments on, is schools. I mean, we've seen a vast, movement, I guess, to do monitoring in school buildings, particularly carbon dioxide, but also relative humidity and heat and temperature. And it's almost why wasn't this done before? We can rehash that in any way you want, but it certainly looks like that's where the money is going to be spent going forward. What would you recommend for somebody who's a manager of a school district, superintendent, or in charge of the buildings? What would you recommend in terms of the type of engineering controls or indoor air quality measurements do you think should be utilized in a school building?
Yeah, schools are a huge opportunity. And Don, again, this sounds self-promotional. I don't mean it that way, but I mean, I think that the metrics that B4H measures, we know that they're all the metrics you need in terms of indoor air components, and you can't really cut any of them out. So I think that's, so temperature, humidity, particles, CO2, carbon monoxide, ozone, and combustion byproducts are the things you need to monitor and manage around. So if I were, or let me put it this way, in the local school here, they have our monitor and they're trying to manage to, given that winter isn't upon us, to a healthy score. But I feel like we need to create this health visibility in all occupied buildings. I know we're not there. But I think that is what we need to do.
Yeah, and if you listened in or saw the White House meeting that they had just 2 weeks ago, one of the panelists there, Rich Corsi, who I've known for many, many years, talked about the fact that he wrote a paper in 2000, actually 22 years ago, talking about this issue, that it's now time for indoor air quality to move ahead. And of course, 22 years later, we're still kind of stuck on this. He also recommended, which was an interesting thing, is that we should have something similar to the Clean Air Act, which he called the Clean Indoor Air Act, and that we should set some kind of standards set on that. What are your thoughts on that?
I 110% concur. And again, that's why I'm really excited about the B4H standard, because it's, and I'm excited about doing more clinical studies around it. But I think I completely agree that we need that. We assume that when we drink water, it's going to be okay. Mm-hmm.
Which is not necessarily true either, but that's a whole different story.
Yeah, but I think that maybe indoor air should turn to a subscription service like water in a town. I think that might be a business model that would alleviate some of the first costs and some of the liability issues from the building owner or manager. But I think that we need to manage indoor air quality, or, you can call it indoor environmental quality to include, light and sound. But I think we need to manage our buildings to support health.
I mean, I would say that I think it's super important, and you've pointed this out, to monitor those parameters. I mean, the parameters we currently don't. I mean, for the most part, buildings are monitored for temperature, right? Really, just sensible heating and cooling is what we look at. Maybe we're looking at carbon dioxide for building occupancy, but that in and of itself is a little bit dicey. I mean, looking at all the parameters that you stated, those 11 parameters, certainly seems like it would give you a much better profile of at least the basis of what's going on in a building.
Am I allowed to show you my monitor? Is that?
Sure.
Sure
Go
can.
ahead.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is our B4H TSI monitor.
And that will measure all 11 parameters?
Yes. Sorry, having a little trouble getting it straight. Yes. So,
okay.
Yeah. And they've really worked to create a stable circuit board so that you don't have the interactivity that you sometimes see with less expensive monitors, where the VOC level will be messed up by ozone and you get some cross reading.
And these are designed to be wall mounted or like stationary, or are they designed to be portable, or both, or
wall mounted?
Okay, so they are a stationary device. Okay.
Yeah. So you can see trends over, use patterns and climactic changes. We also have an outdoor sensor so that we won't recommend bringing in outdoor air if the outdoor air is terrible.
Yeah.
Sure.
One of the big problems worldwide is just that.
Yeah.
You mentioned, well, I'd probably mention WHO, World Health Organization, set a standards in early part of this year about various pollutants, including particulates and ozone and other compounds, which were very, very low. And they admitted themselves that probably 95% of the population is exposed to levels above those standards, mainly because of outdoor pollution more than anything else worldwide. Yeah. So it's a difficult problem. It's an interaction between indoor and outdoor that really becomes a big issue in places other than in North America as well, but even more so in other places where they don't have the mechanical ventilation or heating and systems that we have.
Yeah, but it's a huge opportunity as well, at least to acknowledge that we need to move in that direction, supporting human health with indoor monitoring and management.
Yeah, I think so. The management part is hard because it's one of those things. It's like watching a kettle of water on the stove burn, start to bubble and not necessarily boil. You got all this wonderful data, but where's it going to go and who's going to interpret it? What do you recommend in terms of that? Who interprets the data that you collect in your devices? Is there someone in particular that you would designate to do that?
Well, I'm one of the human computers, so. In terms of quantifying, thankfully, we can actually thank Mother Nature for this too. I was talking with Nicola Karslaw, who you interviewed in September, and she said, but Stephanie, there are 92,000 chemicals that are in the air that are formed by a combination. And I said, I understand that, but there are only about 4 ways that things get through your cells. So Mother Nature sort of compartmentalizes the impact of indoor compounds, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
So you can look at things like water solubility or, polarity for solubility through membranes. You can look at things like reactive oxygen species production. So long story short, I do a lot of the interpretation. We also have colleagues from MIT and the EPA, some other Harvard Med School colleagues who are helping with this approach. To make sure that we're not sort of pie in the sky. And yeah, TSI's bringing their forces in. But as we move to more predictive building management, we're going to need extra, I don't even know what to call it, data analytics and predictive coding. Oh yeah, we have a software team that's based in Atlanta. They outsource to India some of the metrics, some of the coding.
Yeah, and that's good. Basically, it should become a worldwide effort. It's sort of like one building at a time type of approach. I'm not sure exactly how that will, because it's probably worldwide. I don't know how many buildings, probably billions, if I'm, that have the potential for having indoor air quality problems. But one building at a time is what you can do at this point, unless they come up with standards of some sort that I don't anticipate happening within the next 5 to 10 years. It's just a big expense that many school districts already are strapped with, or making those was one of the examples. But building all these themselves and building managers, they're always looking for ways to save money, and it's tough to say, well, you need to do this as well. So it's a hard row to hoe.
But it's pretty important. And that's,
I agree.
And that's, no, we're all on the same page, and we champion this, but I think it's, to Stephanie's point, at this time more than any other time, we have, I think, a better opportunity coming off this pandemic to at least have the general public's ear. So it's incumbent upon all of us in the industry to drive this point forward.
So one case study I would love to tell you about in 30 seconds or less, because I just got the permission from Damon Greeley, Damon Greeley and Jen Wagner have a on-site ONSITE consulting, and this study is about to be published in a peer-reviewed infection control journal, but they looked at managing the environment in operating rooms, and only using operating rooms that were optimized in terms of some of the metrics we've been talking about. And in 2 studies, they've reduced surgical site infections by 3%. So in one hospital, the one that's going to be published, or any day, which looked at abdominal surgery, hysterectomies, abdominal overall, colon surgery, and hysterectomies, they reduced the surgical site infection rate from 8% to 5%, which is still kind of high, but that's a dirty part of your body, especially your colon. In another study, they reduced surgical site infections from 3.9% to 0.5%. So that's a huge savings, both direct costs, indirect costs. I mean, not even to mention the human factors. So I think when you were saying, Bob or Don, that it's expensive, I think we need to expand our viewpoint, our viewport, to include human, the value of the human being.
Sure. You do have to factor that. It can't just be operating costs. It can't just be first construction costs. You have to look further than that.
Yeah. It's a huge opportunity, though, I think.
Oh, we do believe that. Again, unfortunately, having been in this business for 47 years, I've recognized that some opportunities go forward and others don't. But I'm very optimistic about this, as you said, because of the fact that we've just been through a very traumatic experience with the pandemic, that perhaps this is the time. Maybe this is really the turning point. I'm certainly hoping that
if not now, when?
Exactly.
I would ask that question. I mean, when are we going to have a better opportunity to do this?
I agree. All right. Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. I appreciate it. I'm sure Bob has a few things. Oh, one thing I want to mention is that Stephanie's guest appearance here today was sponsored by IEQGA, and in particular, ASHRAE. And so anything we said nasty about ASHRAE, we'll have to explain later, but that's fine. I'm sure
I didn't say anything nasty about ASHRAE.
I hope I didn't.
No, I don't think we did. If there's anyone, it's probably me, because I'm in the midst of it. But anyway, they sponsored this, and we appreciate Stephanie being here. Bob?
So did want to point out that this whole show, the Indoor Environment Show, is a joint collaboration between the International Society of Indoor Air Quality and Climate, ISIAC, and the Indoor Environmental Quality Global Alliance, IEQGA. Both these organizations teamed up with us at Healthy Indoors to put this program on, and it's we're in our I guess we're in our second year, right? At this point, this is the 12th episode, so here we go.
And thank you so much for your work. I have found watching the videos just so helpful, and got me in touch with Dr. Cott. I don't even know if I'm saying her name right, because I call her Nicola. But I find this platform, your organization, so incredibly helpful. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I guess without further ado, we sign off. So we'll be back again in November. We come back every month, at some point every month, for another live edition of the Indoor Environment Show. Till that time, I'm Bob Krell, and for Don and for our guest, Stephanie Taylor, thanks so very much. And hopefully you'll be joining us again in the near future for another episode.